Hello, welcome back. For this video, I'm going to be discussing the primeval history, which is a term that scholars use to refer to Genesis 1 through 11. Now, these are actually some of my favorite chapters in the Old Testament. Um, I like them because they interact with mythologies and creation stories and such from other cultures, and I find that very interesting to think about how the biblical writers were using and interacting with and sometimes disagreeing with um, traditions from other cultures. So it allows us to see what was kind of uniquely Israelite and what it was that they shared with their neighbors. So these chapters deal with origins. They deal with the beginnings of a number of different things. And so if you're following along in the PowerPoint, you'll see that I lay out three different origins that are discussed in the primeval history. So these chapters describe what we'd call primordial time. That means there are no dates here. There's nothing in these chapters that would allow you to correlate it with um, other known history. So there are no chronological markers here. So we call that primordial time. It's really prehistory, before history, recorded history begins. So the primordial time here and the creations and the origins that are described in it are along three lines. So the first is the origins of the cosmos, the universe. So the physical structures of creation, of the earth, the planets, the stars, the sun, all that, the physical structures of creation. And that's described in Genesis 1 and 2. More so in Genesis 1, but to some extent also in Genesis 2. Second is the origins of humanity. And so we read about those in Genesis 1 and 2 as well. Genesis 2 actually focuses more on the creation of humans than Genesis 1 does, but they both do describe it. And one of the things we'll see is that there are really two different creation accounts in the primeval history. Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, we tend to read together, read them as a unity, but they are very clearly two different stories. Now, they're not, I don't think that they are irreconcilable. There are some scholars who would argue that they are contradictory. They are certainly different, but Jews and Christians have for thousands of years been reading both of them together and somehow able to achieve a unity out of them. So it's not an absolute contradiction, but they are clearly coming from two very different perspectives, as we'll see in a little bit. But they both describe the origins of humanity. And then thirdly, the origins of civilization. And this is worked out across a number of chapters from Genesis 3 all the way through Genesis 11, describe different aspects of what we might call civilization. So things like cities. We have the descriptions of the building of the first cities. Things like technologies. In Genesis 4, there's a genealogy that mentions the origins of different crafts, different professions like music and shepherding and metallurgy, working with metals. So the origins of different aspects of civilization. Now, some of that is portrayed negatively. So there are things like the origins of sin kind of fall into that. The origins of things like murder. So you get the murder of Abel by his brother Cain. That would all fit in there. So the origins of civilization, especially, seems to have very much a negative tinge to it. It's sort of a downward spiral of humanity. And so we see that worked out in those chapters. On the whole, actually, Genesis 1 through 11 has a rather negative tone to it. And this is something that stands in contrast to other mythologies of the ancient world, which tended to be very much more positive, that civilization was a great thing, cities were a great thing. But the biblical tradition views this as the fall. This is all the working out of human sin, what we call the fall. So if we turn to Genesis 1 in particular, If you look at the second slide here, this is an artistic rendering of the cosmology that was commonly accepted across the ancient Near East. And the ancient Near East is the term we use to refer to the Middle East in ancient times. So the ancient Near East is the same as what we call today the Middle East, countries like Egypt and Iraq and Syria, and of course Israel would fit in there as well. And they had a common culture. Egypt was a little bit different, but the rest of it had shared in many ways a common culture. And part of that was they had a common way of looking at the world around them, the physical structure. So you'll see on this slide that for one thing, the Earth was flat. They didn't have a round Earth, but they understood that there was the Earth. There were seas, and notice that there are waters under the earth. They see that referred to in the flood story in Genesis 6 through 8, that it talks about the waters that are under the earth, that the fountains of the deep open up and water comes up. So they knew from agriculture, from digging wells, that if you dig down in the ground, there's water there. And so there was water there, and of course we know there are underground springs. There is water under the ground. So they had that. They knew that it sometimes came up, so there were springs, and that you'll also notice at the top there's a dome. It says the firmament or the dome of the sky, and that above that there are waters above the earth. And we actually see this in Genesis 1. That one of the things that God creates, this is on day 2 of creation, is the dome or the firmament that separates the waters that are above the earth from the waters that are below the earth. Because if you look up at the sky, it looks like there's a dome. It looks like glass, like there's something hard there. There's a sphere or a half sphere there. And of course we know that as it's doing right now, it rains. So where's that water coming from? They didn't know anything about the water cycle. So they believed that on the other side of that dome, there must be water, because sometimes the water falls down. So they actually believed that there were windows, there were openings in that firmament that would allow water to come through. Now I show you this because in many ways Genesis 1 has the same cosmology as the ancient Near East, other ancient Near Eastern cultures. If you pay attention to the structures in Genesis 1, they match up very closely with this. So where there's a lot of agreement and sharing is in their understanding of the physical world itself. Now there are some differences in how they believe that they originated and what their purpose is, but the actual structures they largely agreed on. Now, if we look in Genesis 1, you'll notice a few things about Genesis 1. That there's a 7-day structure there. So it's in Genesis 1 that we get creation over a period of 7 days. And you'll notice this is in the PowerPoint, that those 7 days, there seems to be a logic to them. There's a structure to them that makes sense. That each day, when God creates something, and of course he calls it good, corresponds to another day later on. So we could think of this as 2 sets of 3 days, and then the 7th day is set apart. The first 3 days are when God creates, on day 1, he creates light and darkness, so day and night. On the 2nd day, God creates the sky and the seas. Again, he separates the waters that are above from the waters that are below. And then on day 3, God gathers, again, separates. You notice all 3 of these days have a theme of separation. God separates things. So God separates on day 3 the waters into certain areas. So he creates the seas as distinct bodies of water, and the dry land. And then on the dry land there appears plants. So those are the first 3 days, and they are creating structures, environments. The second set of 3 days, days 4 through 6, are populating those environments. So on day 4, God creates the heavenly bodies, the sun, the moon, and the stars. And if you lay that out next to day 1, so day 1 and day 4 relate to one another, because the sun, moon, and stars govern day and night. And it actually says that the greater light, the sun, to rule the day, and the lesser light, the moon, and also the stars, to govern the night. So there's a logical relationship between them. On day 2, when God had created the sky and the seas, if you compare that with day 4, or not day 5, again, he is populating those environments. So what God creates on day 5 is birds, which fly in the sky, and fish that live in the seas. So again, populating the environments that were created on day 2. And then finally on day 6 relates to day 3, because it's on day 6 God creates land animals and humans. And land animals and humans, of course, live on the land and eat the plants that God created on day 3. So there's a symmetry, there's a structure to this, or a framework. So one way of understanding that is that the 7 days here, and we'll get to the 7th day in a second, that the days are not so much about describing chronology, although there is a chronological framework here, but mostly it is logical. It's creating categories, and understanding that creation consists of categories that relate to one another. So it's setting up what we call the priestly worldview, and we'll talk more about this later on in next week when we get into Leviticus and Numbers and so forth. We will talk a lot about the priestly worldview, but Genesis 1 is foundational for it, because the idea here is that creation consists of these defined categories, and those categories and boundaries between them need to be kept intact. That leaves the 7th day. Now, the 7th day is the most important of these days, because it's on the 7th day that God rests. And so this becomes the Sabbath day. And it says that God blessed it and he sanctified it. He made it a holy day. What that means, and again, we'll talk about this more with priestly theology, holy means set apart or different, unique. And so this day is different. It's the only of the days that does not have a corresponding day. It stands apart by itself. And that in and of itself makes it holy. So God creates nothing on that day. It becomes a day of rest. So this is the Genesis 1 account, or what we call the priestly account. It also relates to, when it describes the creation of humans, has its own unique perspective, because Genesis 1 states that humans are created in the image of God. And this is a very important theological concept, that Genesis 1 has a very high anthropology. It views humans as being special in all creation. That humans are like God in some way. They have the image of God, and that means that they, there's a couple different ways you could read it. One is to say there's a physical resemblance. In fact, that's what the Hebrew word is used there. Tselem is most naturally understood to refer to physical appearance. So it could be that God looks like a human, or humans look like God. But through the theological tradition, we've tended to read that as having a couple of other connotations to it. One is that it's the moral image, the idea that we are moral creatures. We have free will, we are capable of good and evil, we are spiritual beings and therefore capable of having a relationship with God, so that it's immaterial. It's our spiritual nature. Another way of understanding that is the political image, that humans are given a role in Genesis 1. Humans, when God creates humans, it says he gave them authority. He caused them to rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and the animals. So humans rule creation on God's behalf. And this is very much along the lines of what you would think of like an emperor and his vassal kings or his governors. If God is the emperor and he owns all of creation, but he has intermediaries who work for him, humans are the vice-regents or the vassals of God who care for and rule over creation on his behalf. So there's a political dimension there as well, as to explain that humans have a responsibility and have authority on earth as created in the image of God. Now, if you get to Genesis 2, and actually you have to go a little bit into it. It's in verse 4, because the first few verses of chapter 2 are the seventh day. But then you get to verse 4, and it's like it starts all over again. Suddenly, in Genesis 2:4, we read, "These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. In the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, when no plant of the field was yet in the earth, and no herb of the field had yet sprung up." So suddenly there are no plants. God had created plants already in Genesis 1, but now it says, when there were no plants on the earth, nothing had sprung up. And if you continue reading on, there's a reason. It hasn't rained any, but it also says, and there was no man to work the ground. And so God creates humans again. So we already had humans created, now they're created again, and now they're created actually first. So in Genesis 1, humans are created last. Now in Genesis 2, we start back over, and there's a different order. Humans come first, then plants, and then finally animals. So here God creates the animals. God creates the animals out of the ground and brings them to the man to try to find a companion for him, because the man is alone. And the animals are not good enough. None of them are suitable. And so God creates woman. He puts the man to sleep, takes a rib from him, and creates a woman out of it. So in Genesis 2, we have a distinction between the creation of man and woman. If you were to compare this back with in Genesis 1, it simply says, male and female, he created them. In Genesis 2, there's a distinction between them, that man is created first, and then woman is created from the rib. So we have two very different creation accounts here, and I want to think a little bit about the significance of those differences. It's not simply that they're different, it's that they have a very different message about humanity and humanity's place in creation. Again, in Genesis 1 is an emphasis on the ruling aspect. The creation is a hierarchy, and humans are at the top, below God, and rule over creation. In Genesis 2, there's a lot more focus on the harmony within creation. You'll notice in Genesis 2, the way humans are created, and in fact the way animals are created, is different. In Genesis 1, God simply speaks and things happen. Let us make man in our own image. In Genesis 2, however, God creates Adam out of the dust of the ground with his hands, it seems, and he breathes into his nostrils the breath of life. So it's a very intimate sort of creation. Likewise with the woman, she is built. Actually, the Hebrew word there is she is built out of the rib of Adam. The animals also are created from the ground, and you'll also remember that plants could not exist, they could not grow without a human to work the ground, and the animals were created to find a companion for humans. So the emphasis in Genesis 2 seems to be on the relationship, the relatedness between different aspects of creation. So humans in particular are the focus here in Genesis 2 is on the centrality of humanity and how everything in nature sort of depends on them. But there's also the relationship between God and humans seems to be much closer in Genesis 2. Again, breathing breath into his nostrils. So it's a more intimate and very human-focused view of creation. And the end purpose of there, in Genesis 1, the purpose was humans rule creation on God's behalf. In Genesis 2, it is that humans work for God in the garden. So that we have a garden here, the Garden of Eden, and the job of humans is to work in that garden. So it's agrarian, it's agriculture. Now that brings us up to really the key turning point here in the primeval history, which is in Genesis 3. This is called the fall because the idea is that it is a decline, or it's the beginning of the decline from the perfect created state in Genesis 1 and 2. So in particular in Genesis 1, you notice God always says everything is good. Here is how it becomes not good. So in Genesis 3, we have the Eden story of the fall of humanity. So this takes place in the Garden of Eden, and it revolves around a command that God gave humans. So there was a command. There was a tree. We read in Genesis 2 about a tree. And God says to the man, "You may freely eat of every tree in the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall die." So there's one rule here. Don't eat from this tree. And of course this is like the shiny red button that if you're told not to press, suddenly all you want to do is press that button. So that tree shows back up in Genesis 3. One day, Adam and Eve are walking in the garden, and they come upon a serpent, and the serpent says to the woman, "Did God say, 'You shall not eat from any tree in the garden'?" The woman said to the serpent, "We may eat from the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, 'You shall not eat from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, nor shall you touch it, or you shall die.'" So there's the rule, don't eat from this tree. This is the first commandment. The serpent, though, sees an opportunity here. And so the serpent said to the woman, "You will not die, but God knows that if you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." So this is actually a very common motif in the ancient Near East, that there's a connection between knowledge and divinity. And the serpent knows this, or this is reflected in the serpent here, that if they eat this tree, the knowledge of good and evil, which may mean more than just morality. Good and evil may be like heaven and earth, light and darkness, meaning everything, knowing everything. That if they gain this knowledge, they will be divine. They will be like God, because they'll have this knowledge that only God is allowed to have. And so that seems to be the key here. It's not simply the fruit. It's that they want to be like God. And if you think about this, especially in terms of Genesis 1, the boundaries, I said the boundaries and the categories in creation are very important. None more important than the division between God as creator and all of the creations. This is important later on in the New Testament in Romans 1, when we worship creatures rather than the creator. But here, you have creatures that want to become like the creator. They want to step outside of their category, cross that boundary into another one. That is a big problem in priestly theology. So that is what they want. They want to become like God. So they eat the fruit. And it says their eyes were opened and they knew good and evil. And among other things, they know that they're naked. And so they cover themselves and they hide from God. So we have the first commandment, we also have the first transgression. And the origins here of evil are associated with human disobedience, that there's a command and humans choose to disobey it. They choose to step outside of their proper place in creation. Of course, God shows up, God confronts them, and the truth comes out. And the result is a number of curses on creation. So we read about these, that they include punishments for all three parties involved. First, for the serpent, that the serpent is cursed to crawl on his belly and eat dust all the days of his life, that there will be enmity or strife, conflict between humans and the serpent. And there's even a little bit, has been understood as sort of a prophecy here. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel. And has often been understood as a messianic prophecy, that there's going to be a descendant of Eve who will crush the head of the serpent, but will also be wounded by the serpent. And then, of course, thinking about Jesus, the crucifixion of Jesus, and so that's the bruising of the heel. For the woman, there are punishments. I will greatly increase your pains in childbearing. In pain you will bring forth children. Yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. And so you could say the historic subjugation of women to men is reflected here. Notice, though, this is a curse. This is not God's design. This is not the way it was supposed to be, but it is a bad thing. So some have tried to use this text to support, say, women should be subjected to men because of this, but I think that's a bad reading, because this is a curse. It is not a good thing. It is not God's design. It's an unfortunate reality that has resulted from sin. And then finally, for the man, it says that the earth will no longer cooperate, right? The ground is cursed because of you. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread until you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. You are dust, and to dust you shall return. And that last part there is kind of the key. Death. So Genesis 3 associates death with the consequence of sin. In fact, God had told Adam and Eve that on the day that they ate from the fruit of that tree, they would die. Of course, they don't die that day. It is understood as the process of death begins that day, that they become mortal. Some would also say maybe they die spiritually here. But now the consequence is they are going to die. And in fact, they are the possibility of immortality is removed from them, because there was another tree in that garden, the tree of life. And after they have sinned, God says, see, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. And now he might reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever. So God removes them from the garden and places a cherub, an angelic warrior, a guardian figure, with a flaming sword to guard the entrance to the garden so that they can't eat from the tree of life. Because presumably if they could, they would live forever and they really would be gods. But that is removed from them. Now that shows up later on in later apocalyptic texts, like you get to the book of Revelation. The tree of life is there and humans are able to eat from it. So that represents immortality. But here, immortality is removed. The idea is we had access to it, and now it is gone. So thus begins the fall. And you read throughout the rest from chapters 4 through 11, the consequences, the working out of that. So in chapter 4, we have a story about Cain and Abel, these brothers, that ends up in fratricide. The first murder is Cain murdering his brother Abel out of jealousy, because God accepts Abel's offering. Abel is a shepherd. He accepts his offering and rejects Cain's. Now, we don't actually find out why. There seems to be something maybe in Cain's heart, whatever his disposition is. God does not receive his offerings favorably, but does Abel's. And so sibling rivalry here leads to murder, as Cain kills Abel and then is cursed. It's actually in the genealogy of Cain that we read about the origins of a lot of aspects of civilization. In his son, Enoch, is said to have built a city and named it Enoch after his son. So the origins of city dwelling, urbanism, are tied to the line of Cain. Also, it is his descendants who institute these various types of technology. So down in Genesis 4 and verse 20, this is one of Cain's descendants is named Lamech, and his wife, and he has these children. Ada, Lamech's wife, bore Jabal. He was the ancestor of those who live in tents and have livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the ancestor of all those who play the lyre and pipe. And Zillah, another wife, bore Tubal-Cain, who made all kinds of bronze and iron tools. The sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. So you've got an implicit connection here between civilization and sin, that it's associated with this sinful, murderous line of Cain. Because it's not just Cain. Lamech is also said to have killed people. So this is a murderous line. But it shows that the spiral, the downward spiral of humanity. In Genesis 5, there's a genealogy. We won't really deal with that. But next we come to there's an interesting little story in Genesis 6, 1 through 4 about the sons of God and the daughters of man. Now, elsewhere in the Old Testament, the expression sons of God is a reference to heavenly beings, to angels. For example, they show up in the first couple chapters of Job. The sons of God are angels. And so that's probably the best way to read it here. That's the way the early Jews and Christians clearly read it this way. As disturbing as this might be, because what happens in this text, the sons of God, these angels, take human wives. They marry human women, and they have children with them. And these children are called the Nephilim, and they are described as these gigantic warriors. And so this is, again, another sign of the breakdown of those barriers, now that the barrier between humans and the angels has fallen apart. This is very, very similar to what we find in ancient Near Eastern and Greek myths about people like Hercules or Gilgamesh, who are part god, part human. So the Nephilim are very similar to the demigods in these mythic traditions. And later on, outside the Bible, there's a book called First Enoch and these other apocalyptic traditions where this story is extremely important, that they really point to this as the main origins of evil in the world. But it's very much a minor note here. But it does fit into this overall downward trajectory that we see in these chapters, culminating, of course, in the flood. So in Genesis 6 through 8, we have the story of the great flood. This is the result of wickedness. So God saw that the wickedness of humankind was great on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their heart was only evil continually. And so God was sorry that he had made humankind on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So God makes the decision to destroy the earth. It's too bad. Humans are too wicked, and so he's going to destroy them and everything else to get rid of it. But there is one righteous person, and his name is Noah. Noah finds favor with God. And so God warns Noah about the coming flood and instructs him to build a boat and take animals on board. And so Noah, this is where you get the 2x2, the animals that come on board, and Noah and his family and these animals are all that survive this great flood. Now this story is interesting not only in that it's this great catastrophe and it's ties into the massive downward trajectory that humanity takes after the fall, but it's also where we find a lot of parallels in other cultures. In the ancient Near East, in particular, there are numerous versions of this story, but they're very, very similar. The most famous of them comes from the Epic of Gilgamesh. From Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh is the guy who survived the flood. Basically Noah, but his name is Utnapishtim. And he recounts the story of how he survived this flood. And it's very interesting because he says, a god warned me that the flood was coming, told me to build a boat and take on it a bunch of animals. And so that happens, and he survives the flood. And it even down to some very small details, like when the waters have stopped, when the rain has stopped, to see if the waters have receded, he starts sending out birds. And the bird One of them comes back with an olive branch in its mouth, and that's how he knows the waters have receded. And of course, that's exactly what happens in the biblical story here as well. So it's more than coincidence. It seems like they all have access to the same tradition, perhaps, and also Gilgamesh and these other stories are actually older than the book of Genesis, at least when it was written. So it may be that the Bible is in part drawing on these traditions, using them as a source. Of course, it could also be, and probably is more likely, that they are both drawing on a common source tradition. But this is international type of literature. It's not distinctly Israelite. Out of the flood comes a covenant. Now, we're going to talk a lot about covenants in this class, but in a nutshell, a covenant is an agreement. It's a contract between God and humanity, or certain humans. And the first of these is enacted right after the flood. It's called the Noachic covenant. That after Noah comes off the boat, God blesses him and sort of starts over with creation. In fact, echoes Genesis 1. He says, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth," which is exactly what he commanded Adam and Eve as well. But here God makes a promise. It says that it says this verse 9, "As for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and with your descendants after you and with every living creature that is with you, the birds and the domestic animals and every animal of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark." So all life is included in this covenant. "I will establish my covenant with you so that I will never again cut off by the waters of the flood all life. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth." So this is a promise not to destroy the earth again. And God gives them a sign. He puts the rainbow in the sky. Says that whenever I see the rainbow, I will remember my covenant. Which is interesting to think about, why God needs a reminder. God should remember anyway, but the idea here is he sees this and remembers the covenant and does not destroy the earth. So the rainbow is the sign here. This is the first of many covenants that we will see in the Old Testament. Next comes a genealogy. So after the flood, the three sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japhet, become the ancestors of all the different nations. And there's a genealogy that sorts them out into three different categories. This is conceptual so that the Israelites could understand their place in the world. And so these three categories, there's first Shem, is the ancestor of Israel and its kin, the people groups that they understood themselves to be related to. Second is Ham. All the descendants of Ham are the traditional enemies of Israel, like the Canaanites, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians are all descendants of Ham. So these are the bad guys. And finally there's Japhet, whose descendants are the far-off nations, like the Greeks. People that they knew about, but didn't really have day-to-day relations with. All right. So it's organizing the world. Now, the primeval history then ends with a couple things. At first, it ends there in Genesis 11. There's a story about the Tower of Babel. Now, this also relates to civilization because Babel is Babylon. That's the Hebrew word for Babylon. And Babylon was the cultural center of the ancient Near East. It was what New York City is today, or what Rome was during the Roman Empire. It is the center of civilization. It was the political capital and the center of culture. And this is an alternate founding narrative for this city. Now, the word Babylon means, in the Akkadian language, it means gate of God. And it has a special place in Babylonian mythology. There's a Babylonian creation story called Enuma Elish. It's not important for us to get into all the details of the story. It's about a battle between a god and a monster, and the earth is created out of it. But it ends with the last thing that Marduk creates is his temple, which is the temple in Babylon. So the city of Babylon and its most important building, the Temple of Marduk, are the center and the focal point, the pinnacle of creation. In Genesis 1, you'll remember the pinnacle of creation, the last thing God created, was humanity. So there's perhaps some tension, some polemic between these two stories. But also, I think, here with Genesis 11, because this is an alternate version of where Babylon comes from. That is not the gate of God. It is not the pinnacle of creation. But in fact, this is a story about human pride. So God commands humans to spread out over the earth. But in Genesis 11, humans defy it. It says, the whole earth had one language and the same words. As they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar, which is Mesopotamia, the Iraq today, is where Babylon was located. And they settled there, and they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. And they said, come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we shall be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. So this is humans uniting to make a name for themselves. There's sort of an air of defiance and pride here. They don't want to be scattered. And so, in fact, the connotations of a tower with its top reaching into heavens, we're going to ascend to where God is. We're going to make ourselves like God. You notice that theme again, just as in Genesis 3. Got kind of bookended here, the beginning and the end, that humans want to be like God. Humans want to ascend to the place of God. And that's a bad thing here, because it shows that they are not respecting the uniqueness, the holiness of God. So what happens? God comes down and God thwarts their plans by confusing their languages. This is an etiology. It's a story that explains how something comes to be for human languages, for multiple languages. So God confuses their language, and this is where the name Babylon comes from in this story. So the Hebrew word for confuse or mix up is balal. And balal sounds very similar. It's a pun. It's a word play for the word Bavel. So the way the story explains it is that the place was called Babel, because there God confused or mixed up their languages. In other words, this story is making fun of Babylon and saying it is not the center of creation. It is, in fact, a symbol of confusion. So you can read this story as anti-Babylonian propaganda. It is meant to sort of hit back against Babylon. So many scholars believe that this may have been written during the time when the Israelites were imprisoned in Babylon, what's called the Babylonian exile in the 6th century, which we'll discuss later on when we get into the historical books and Kings where this happens. But it has some political implications, certainly. Finally, the Primeval History ends with a little bit of a positive note. It's mostly a very dark collection of stories, but it ends on a bit of a bright note because there's a genealogy at the end. After the Tower of Babel, there's a guy named Abram who is born. And Abram will play a very important role in what follows. Abram is from a city called Ur, which was in Mesopotamia, south of Babylon. It was a major cultural center. But for some reason, Abram's father, Terah, left the city of Ur and began to travel west. And he stopped at a place called Haran, which is kind of on the border between Iraq and Syria today. And he dies there. And now God, the one God, Yahweh, the God of the Bible, appears and speaks to Abraham, or to Abram, whose name will later become Abraham, and tells him to leave his family, leave his land, and go and journey to a place where God will show him. And if he will do that, God will bless him and make him into a nation. This is the beginnings of the story of Israel, because Abram is the ancestor of the Israelites. And it shifts the focus here from universal history and origins to now the Bible is going to focus in on one particular group of people. That is the Israelites, the descendants of Abraham. And the focus of the Old Testament will be on them for the rest of the story, really. So this is sort of a bridge that's going to connect us to what comes next in what's called the ancestral narratives. So with that, we'll end here, and the next video will examine the ancestral narratives, the origins of the Israelites in particular.